All right, good morning and welcome. Today we're looking at Daniel chapter 3. This is our fourth installment in our teaching through the book of Daniel. We started with an introduction and then we looked into chapter 1. And of course, we've looked at chapter 2, and this is Daniel chapter 3. What's interesting about Daniel chapter 3 is that it actually has nothing to do with Daniel. It's actually about Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it kind of puts the spotlight on these three Jewish boys and their great commitment to faithfulness, even in the face of punishment and their own death. And we get an excellent example from their faithfulness in that while they are faithful, not actually knowing if God is going to vindicate them or not, as we're going to look at in the passage, they end up being exalted at the end of the passage and vindicated by actually growing in ranks in their exiled position within the Babylonian Empire. That's one of the things that we've continued to see in each of the chapters. We've seen that those who are actually faithful to what God says, even when they are in a foreign land or they're in difficult times, that they are rewarded. That's a common theme, and we need to see that. We need to see that each chapter ends with a reward given to the people that do what's right, even when everyone else is doing what is wrong. And I know that this particular message sounds kind of simple, almost simplistic, like, hey, do the right thing, even if all the other kids are doing the wrong thing. It's something that we as adults really need to hold on to, especially in our world today that seems to be growing ever more increasingly evil and wicked, and that the people that stand up and do the right things, the things that God tells us to do, are often being punished for doing what is right, for being innocent. So we can learn a lot from this example. And I think that its message is continues to be really powerful for readers of the Bible. So without further ado, let's begin looking at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right. So I gave the title for this message, Faith Under Fire. There's a deliberate pun with that, as you'll see. And if you're familiar with the story, then obviously you'll see that these people were literally saved from the fire because of their faithfulness. So the passage is not very long. It's only 30 verses. I say that in comparison to chapter 2, which was much longer. So we'll go ahead and just read through the entire thing, but I think you're going to kind of really see that it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it doesn't really require a lot of comment or commentary. It just kind of, it tells it as it is. So let's begin. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I mean, you get the impression, like, look at what this guy did. He set up this image, okay? Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it is usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. And these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothing, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because of the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of the blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, Certainly, O king. He said, Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of the blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's commands and yielding up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. And you can see there, just in that final line there, there's kind of that promise of vindication and the rewarding in the present for those that are faithful to to God and God's precepts. Okay. And you can see the story again is pretty straightforward. Okay. We've got this tyrannical king, okay, who thinks very highly of himself, and he sets up an image and he wants people to worship the image. Okay. And the text is clear on a couple of points. It indicates that Nebuchadnezzar is certainly guilty for setting up this image, and any Jewish reader is going to know that setting up an image is something you're not supposed to do. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar is framed as bad, and even at the end, even though he kind of acknowledges that God can do this, there's no indication that, well, the king, rescinded his decree that people should be worshiping his image, or that he tore down his statue. I mean, he's kind of this, he's just this, gray area sort of person. And yet he's not asking people to worship him as a god, because images were not gods themselves. The images were meant to kind of reflect the god that they were designed to imitate. Okay. So when people were bowing down to like an ivory statue of a god, they didn't think that statue was the god. That was just an image of the god. Okay. So again, a lot of this, it just doesn't need a lot of comment. So I'm just going to kind of point out some things that you might think are pretty obvious, pretty self-evident. But I might point out a couple of points in the text that are new to you. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read the text again. I just kind of have it on the left for your benefit. And so something that's clear to me, obviously, with the placement of this particular chapter after chapter 2, is that Nebuchadnezzar, not being satisfied with being the head of gold in the previous dream, that's in Daniel chapter 2, he now sets up a 90 by 9 foot statue of gold. Okay, it tells you it's 60 cubits by 6, but a cubit is 1.5 feet. So you have a 90-foot tall statue that is 9 feet wide. Okay, now what's really interesting about this, and I never really thought about it until I try to really picture this in my head. What does this look like? Because if you go online and you type in Daniel chapter 3 statue of gold, you'll get images like this. Okay, yeah, it's a 90-foot tall statue. I get that. Okay, and you see it's like, okay, well, a statue looks like it's in proportion, but I want you to think about it. Something that is 90 by 9, the proportions there are 10 to 1. 10 to 1. Okay, so these are what the pictures show you, but in reality, this is what something that is having the proportions of 10 to 1 actually looks like. You see this? It's like it's really, 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 really tall, but the proportions are just, again, it just looks it looks odd. But the point there is to show, like, hey, look at how tall this looks. Look at how great it is. And obviously it's completely made of gold. Okay, so I just let's really take into account the dimensions that are there. I mean, yeah, it's 9 feet wide, which sounds like it's really really wide, but when it's 90 feet tall, the proportions of a person are going to be, you can see they're a bit exaggerated. You could say that's the point. I mean, it's so over the top that it's exaggerated. Okay. Okay. So he makes that. Obviously, that tells the reader that Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, he's extremely arrogant. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we've learned that he was the head of gold in the previous image, but the image in Daniel chapter 2 indicates that Babylon is going to be defeated by the Persian Empire. So it's not going to last very long. So, he's not that great, but of course he still thinks very highly of himself. Okay. And, he's surrounded by all of these persons. So you kind of get the sense there that you have all of these different types of people, and the translation of these various types of people, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, and magistrates, and the rulers of the provinces. Obviously this passage is in Aramaic, but what's interesting there is that when we try to kind of figure out what these words actually mean, they tell us a little bit about the time period in which this was written. We got actually, if you go back and you count them actually in Aramaic, you actually have 7 different types of persons, but most of them actually are drawing upon terms that actually are from the Persian language. And that's not the only interesting thing about this. You'll notice that the particular orchestra that Nebuchadnezzar's kind of put together, and you see it kind of repeated, and it's a horn, a flute, a lyre, a trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all these different types of music. This is not the type of music that when you take this passage and you compare it to the type of music that was in the Jerusalem temple, Solomon's temple, the temple sort of worship. It's like when you look at this, and if you know anything about like orchestra music, you think this is odd. This sort of music it sounds awkward. This is not a band that we would know of today. But even this particular orchestra arrangement, many of the phrases actually are actually Greek phrases that have been kind of put back into Aramaic. And so to a lot of scholars, what this tells us is that this passage was probably something that wasn't written in the time of the 6th century. This chapter was probably written sometime a little bit later because we have all these terms that just wouldn't make any sense, or they just weren't in existence in the 6th century. But that's okay, because obviously this particular story continued to be meaningful, and it continued to inspire faithfulness and confidence despite whenever it was actually written. Okay. So again, it's just kind of an interesting side point. I'm not making it a big issue here. Okay. So we get the sense that all the peoples were obeying this decree. They were falling down and they were worshiping it. And what's interesting here is that you actually get the names of the persons who didn't comply. And it's only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so I'm sitting here reading this and I'm asking the question, what about all the other Jews? Did all the other Jews compromise and give into the threats of punishment? And then the other question is like, where is Daniel? Daniel's not even mentioned in the entire thing. Now, I don't think that just because only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are mentioned here, that Daniel disobeyed. I don't think it's clear that this story is its own story. I mean, you if you wanted to, you could have Daniel chapter 3, and it could be its own book of the Bible, and you wouldn't know the difference. Okay. And the impact of their bravery and their courage wouldn't be diminished in that. Okay. It's a story about them. It's a story about these 3 particular guys. Okay. But the sense is almost as if like these are the ones that are being faithful and obedient. It's not like all the Jews are being defiant to Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost like these are the 3 ones that are doing that. They're the ones that are called out. They're the only ones that are thrown into the fiery furnace. Okay. So I'm sensing here an interesting part of the story that even sometimes the faithful people of God, even they will struggle to be faithful at times. Even they will struggle, and they will give in to compromise. Okay, like that's not unheard of. I get that. I mean, even Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Okay, so I think what's interesting here is that even among the Jewish people, you have a handful of people that are ultimately going to be faithful, but some others, at least they're not identified as doing that. And I can't read anything further into the text, only the fact that we only have 3 people that are identified for their faithfulness and nobody else. Okay. But I think it's probably a little uncharitable to suggest that since Daniel is not mentioned, that Daniel was disobedient. I don't think that's a good and kind of charitable reading of the text. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar, of course, gathers them together and kind of asks them the question like, hey, you need to do this. And they get a chance to respond. And this is kind of the only talking that they actually get to do in the particular passage. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar asked the question. He's like, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Who is this? And I think to myself, well, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, as great as you might be, you seem to have forgotten the last chapter where you personally admitted that Daniel's God, the God of the Jewish people, the Jewish God, has actually helped you to reveal the meaning of your dream. Okay, you seem to have quickly forgotten that. Okay, so there's a sense here to where Nebuchadnezzar is so arrogant that he's like, there's no other God out there that is as strong as the Babylonian gods. And of course, he doesn't think very highly of the Jewish gods because the Babylonian gods supposedly helped to defeat the God of the Jews, because the Jews were, they were conquered, they were exiled, and their temple was destroyed. And if you destroy a god's temple, you destroy their God. Okay. But also you get the sense to where he's just forgetting what has already taken place. Okay, so there's just kind of a double sense of arrogance there. Okay. All right. Now the response from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're kind of portrayed here as all speaking together, I think is very interesting. Okay. And there's a little bit of ambiguity in the sentence that tries to be clarified in your translation. So you might notice a little bit of a different translation of the first sentence, where it says, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of fire. So the question is like, if it's so, our God can deliver us. Well, okay, like, is God going to do it? Is he not? And it's sort of unclear, because it says, look, he will deliver us. But then they go on and they say, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Okay. And so I think kind of what they're saying is, first of all, there is a God who can do this. Second, God is able to vindicate us. But if he doesn't do it, then we're not going to give in. We're not going to give in to your idolatrous claims. Okay. We're not going to give up our faithfulness. We're not going to give up our obedience to God's precepts just because we're threatened and we're going to be punished. Okay. They didn't think that, well, we need to preserve our lives, and well, let's just kind of break God's commandments so that we can live a little bit longer. They didn't do that. Okay. And I think their commentary is like, look, it's something that I think we really have to kind of keep in mind. And I think it's something that if we think honestly, we will admit that sometimes God intervenes and he delivers people, and sometimes that intervention is delayed until the day of judgment, to where the intervention happens at the resurrection. Okay. Because not every, some people actually are martyred. Okay. Some people actually do die. Okay. Now they were willing to be martyred. Okay. And God did intervene, but even their initial statement here is like, even if he doesn't. Okay. So God can do it. Sometimes he does. It actually did happen in this particular instance, but sometimes God doesn't. Okay. Sometimes that vindication is delayed until the day of judgment and the resurrection. All right. But their commitment, I think, is the same. Okay. We are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Okay. And again, just a reminder, they're not worshiping Nebuchadnezzar. They're worshiping Nebuchadnezzar's image. Okay. All right. And so their commitment to faithfulness is actually bound together in their understanding of God as one who sometimes intervenes. Okay. Sometimes God intervenes, and we're going to be faithful to you because of that. Right. And that's very important. Okay. All right. So we know the story. They get thrown in, and you kind of have this irony that the people that had tied them together and bound them, and they bound them in like all the different parts of their clothing, they were scorched up in this fire. This fire, by the way, that, I mean, you get the sense of the story. Like Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make the fire 7 times hotter than what it normally was. I mean, you think that number 7, okay? That 7 is kind of a number of completion there, okay? We're wondering, okay, what is this? Are you really taking the fire that's, is it 200 degrees and now it's 1400 degrees? Or is the number 7 functioning in a way that, we've kind of come to expect for the number 7 to function in apocalyptic literature, just like we see in the book of Revelation. By the way, if you count the number of officials that came together with Nebuchadnezzar's decree and summons, there were also 7 different types of officials there. So you have kind of a complete sense of obedience to his decree. So anyway, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get thrown in. The people that tried to throw them in, they actually get burnt up, but they get delivered. And what we're told in the story is that there was a fourth figure that was there, and that figure is one like a son of the gods. Okay. Now, if you have a King James Bible, by the way, it's going to tell you who the King James translators think it is. They think it is the Son of God. They think it's Jesus. They think it's Jesus. Okay. But all modern translations have removed that definite article because it's not the Son of God. It is one of the sons of the gods. Okay. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar actually clarifies for you. He tells you quite clearly that, look, this is an angel. This is an angel, okay? And we have this language of the Son of Gods in a very similar type of language arrangement, okay? Because we have to remember, Daniel chapter 3 is in Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew. But in Hebrew, we have the phrase B'nai Elohim in a couple places in Genesis chapter 6, and also in a couple of places in Job, the first 2 chapters of Job, that referred to, I think, quite clearly, angels. And by angels, I mean heavenly messengers, okay? Not just general neutral messengers. These are heavenly messengers, messengers from God, heavenly agents, envoys. That's what they are, okay? So this is not Jesus, not some sort of pre-existent Jesus that was there. This is an angel, okay? Jesus is not an angel, okay? Jesus wasn't even born or alive at this particular point in the story, okay? So, so God vindicates Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by sending an angel in order to help them, okay? And of course, as we're going to see later in the book of Daniel, we're going to see God continue to send angels in order to intervene through this prophetic book and also in assisting the faithful people of God in various ways. Okay. Yeah, and I think that's the important part of the story. Got to make sure we identify who that is, and of course, the early Christian tradition that that at least in early English translations that suggested that this was Jesus, but that's not what the text says. Okay. And then Nebuchadnezzar, when he acknowledges what actually took place, he regards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not just as the servants of the Most High God, but as, quote, his servants who put their trust in him. Okay? They are the servants of the Most High God who had put their trust, their faithfulness, their loyalty, their obedience into him. Okay? They're not just people that have one God or believe in one God. They're those that are committed and faithful to him. And their trust and their faith was demonstrated with their acts of obedience. Okay. And of course, we see the vindication at the end of the story for obeying God, even under the threat of punishment. Because let's be honest, okay? It's really easy to obey God when there's no threat or there's no punishment or there's no retaliation for doing what is right. Okay. It's difficult to obey when you could face social harassment, when you could be denounced, when you could lose family members, when you could lose friends, when you could potentially lose your job, when you could be harmed physically, when you could be threatened, when family members could be threatened, or when you could be thrown in jail, or when you could, potentially lose your own life or the life of a loved one. Okay. I mean, let's be honest. Okay. It's harder to do that when there's a threat of punishment. It's easy to do it when there's no threat. Okay. And so again, the story highlights the fact that they were, of course, not only were they rescued from sudden death, but they were actually exalted and vindicated for doing what is right. Okay. And this is the last time that we actually hear of these 3 Jewish boys within the book of Daniel. Okay. And you know what? They didn't need to show up in every single chapter of the book of Daniel in order to have their acts of faithfulness laid in the pages of history. Okay. Like it's obvious that this is the story. I think it's one of the most powerful stories of bravery and courage in the entire Bible. Okay. And I don't think that it gets as much press as it probably should. Okay. Now, throughout our studies of the book of Daniel, one of the things that I've really tried to emphasize is the fact that that the original readers of the book of Daniel were probably Jewish readers in the 2nd century BC that were struggling with what is the right thing to do in the midst of the tyrannical reign of Antiochus Epiphanes IV and the Maccabean revolt. Okay, should they compromise their Jewish faith and just do what the seemingly overpowerful Greek rulers are impressing upon the Jewish people? Should they go to the other extreme and pick up their weapons and their swords, and they should fight off these people and to murder and kill those that that blaspheme the God of Israel? Or is there some sort of middle ground where I'm not actually compromising, but I'm not actually resorting to violence? But again, if we read the basic sort of things that were taking place in this time period, and this is, around the years, 171 through 164 BC, in that kind of 7-year period, and you see what was actually going on in Daniel chapter 3, you could see, oh, okay, they would have drawn inspiration from this particular story in order to be faithful. But one of the interesting things that you see about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that they don't pick up arms and swords and weapons and spears and start a revolt against Nebuchadnezzar. So look at what's going on here. Again, this is recorded in the historical book of First Maccabees. And again, I want you to see in this the sort of things that are taking place and think to yourself, okay, how might Daniel chapter 3 encourage me if this is the sort of stuff that's going on during that time period? Okay, so this is in First Maccabees 1, starting in verse 54. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected an abomination of desolation on the altar of burnt offering. And they also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The book of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and they burnt it with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by the decree of the king. Sound familiar? They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, okay, so just 10 days later, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of the burnt offering. Okay, so this abomination of desolation that was put on top of the altar in the Jerusalem temple. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised and their families and those who circumcised them. And here's the awful part that I hate to even read out loud. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and resolved in their heart to not eat the unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food and to profane the Holy Covenant. And they did die. And that's the end of basically the first chapter of First Maccabees. Again, that's a historical account of things that actually took place there. Okay, you can see, look at the story. Okay, we have this, we have a pagan image that is set up. Okay, there's a decree from the king that people should not be obeying the precepts and the commands of the Jewish God. Those that obeyed were put to death. Okay, and you got some people that said they would rather die than to disobey God and to disobey the Holy Covenant. Okay, that's exactly what took place in Daniel chapter 3. I mean, the people reading Daniel chapter 3 in this particular time period would have been encouraged, and they would have been resolved in their convictions to do as the last passage says: choose to die rather than to be defiled or to profane the Holy Covenant. And not all these people were vindicated, at least in their own lifetime. Many of these people were martyred. And of course, the book of Daniel is going to end in chapter 12 with the promise of resurrection, which is how God is ultimately going to vindicate people. So that's, I think, how Daniel 3 was interpreted by the original readers of Daniel. But what about the modern readers? What about people in 2023 and every year from here on out? Okay. Number one. Okay. And again, I think this slide is probably the most important thing that I'm going to say today. Okay. So this, if you've ignored everything else, focus on this part right here. Okay. All right. Number one, if we claim to have faith in Jesus and his gospel, the kingdom, then this must result in faithfulness in his teachings, even if there are consequences for doing so. And this calls for a resolute commitment to seek to understand the will of God and be courageous in the face of opposition. Okay? If you claim to be a believer, okay, this means that you have to be faithful and recognize that there are consequences many times for doing what is right. Okay? So we got to be resolute in our commitment to not only understand what is the right thing we're supposed to be doing. Okay, if I want to be faithful, I have to know what it is that I need to be faithful to. I have to understand what the will of God actually is, and I need to have the courage to do what is right, even if everyone else is doing what is wrong. Okay, I need to have the courage to do what is right, even when I am silenced, when I'm being suppressed, when I'm being deplatformed, when I'm being threatened, when people are calling me names, and we need to have the courage to do that. And that, of course, requires prayer, that requires encouragement of each other, that requires continuing to look to people that are great examples of faithfulness, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, people like John the Baptist, Jesus, the Apostle Paul. Hopefully leaders in our church community continue to function as examples of this. Okay? We got to be committed to understand what God wants us to do, what it is we're supposed to be faithful to, and we got to be courageous to be faithful when we are in the face of opposition. Number 2, as we participate in the Great Commission, a key component of teaching others to observe all that Jesus commanded is the exhortation to do what is right, even when everyone else is doing something wrong. Okay? We have to do what is right, even when everyone else is doing something wrong. And this vital teaching should be consistently passed on from parents to children, from church leaders to followers, and even among one another within the new covenant people of God. Okay? So if you have children, you have a responsibility to teach this important precept that you need to do the right thing. You need to obey Jesus, even if everyone else isn't doing it, and even if there are consequences for doing so. Okay? This should not be some sort of like advanced, high-level, super spiritual teaching. This has got to be basic, foundational, the ABCs of the Christian faith. Okay? To have faith means to be faithful to Jesus. Okay? To believe in Jesus means you're faithful to him. Okay? This has got to, and we have to teach people to do this. Okay? We have to model this. Okay? We should hold our leaders to the standard of teaching and encouraging us to do this. And you don't need to be a parent with children to do this. You don't need to be a leader to pass this on to other people. Like, each of us have a responsibility to encourage people to do this, to model this, and to teach this. Again, it's something that we have to do. Okay, it's a vital part of the Great Commission. Jesus showed us how it was done. Okay, when he was wrongly arrested and crucified, he didn't, of course, compromise and give up in order to save his life. He didn't pick up weapons and swords in order to fight off the people that were wrongly treating him and arresting him. He trusted in God, that God would vindicate him. He didn't disobey. He was faithful. And even though he died, God vindicated him with resurrection. Okay? And the way that God vindicated Jesus was different than the way that God vindicated Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the point is, God is faithful, and he's going to take care of the people that are faithful to him. Number 3, when someone in the Christian community suffers because they took a faithful stand to obey Christ, we should seek to offer them comfort, love, and support. Okay? So as we continue to obey Jesus, we're going to see that people are going to suffer. Okay? They might be hurt. They might be injured. They might lose job opportunities. They might lose their job. They might lose income. They might lose friends. We have to show them love. We have to show them compassion. We have to find ways to show them support. Okay? Because when you suffer for your faith, the reason why people try to persecute those people is to break their resolve. It's to break their faithfulness. Okay? And when someone is struggling to be courageous and they've suffered persecution, the best way to help them is to show them support, is to show them love, and to give them comfort. Okay, so again, if we understand this is a difficult thing to do, we have to help them. Okay, the help doesn't just come from their own internal resolve to do what is right. It doesn't just come from looking at biblical examples like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jesus, and others. It comes from us functioning as a community of love and support and comfort. And lastly, the testimony of the three boys indicates an important truth that we must always keep in mind. Sometimes God intervenes to rescue the faithful, and sometimes that intervention is delayed until the resurrection on the day of judgment. So our faith must not collapse if God chooses to wait to vindicate us. Okay? We might read this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and think, oh, well, the application is that if we do what is right, God is always going to vindicate us. It doesn't work that way. Example, look at Jesus. Okay? God didn't rescue him from the cross. He allowed Jesus to die. Okay? God vindicated him by raising him from the dead. Okay? God doesn't always rescue people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the promise is God's going to do it. And if God doesn't rescue us in the time period, meaning we do have to suffer, meaning we are going to be ostracized or deplatformed or silenced, or we're going to lose our job, or we're going to be injured, or we're going to be threatened, or someone might actually be martyred, our faith can't fall apart. Okay? Our commitment can't fall apart. Like we have to remain resolute and convicted if God chooses to wait. You know, he has set a day of judgment, okay, in which, you know, those that have been wronged are going to be made right, and those that have done wrong are going to be punished, okay? We might actually die, but of course we're going to be raised from the dead on the day of judgment, okay? Our faith must not collapse if God chooses to wait to vindicate us. Jesus' faith didn't collapse when God didn't rescue him from the cross. When Jesus said, if it be your will, you know, take this cup from me. But in the end, he said, not my will, but your will be done. And that has to be the example for all of us. So I think that the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still continues to be a very powerful example of how we can be faithful to Jesus as his kingdom people in the here and now. So I'll stop the recording and open things up for questions and comments. Thanks for watching this if you have watched it, and I hope you've been blessed by this message. We'd love to have you. So check out the info in the description of this video for how you can get in contact with us. Thanks so much for watching, and be blessed.